Today we'll be taking a look at the Kohler Portrait Ingenium toilet, a toilet that's been made since 1997 and was made up until the mid-to-late 2000s. I felt like it's time I started reviewing some Ingenium models, and this is probably the perfect one to start with considering it's one of the earliest ones. So let's take a look at it and see what it has to offer. The overall design is quite nice. I really like how this looks. It looks very nice and very fancy, especially for an older design like this. Something I would like to note is that this model is only exclusively standard height. You can get it round, you can get it elongated, but you cannot get this comfort height, meaning that this is exclusively a standard height toilet. And that's all this thing was offered with. The same can go for the Portrait Lite. The trapway opening is just another trapezoid shaped opening with a siphon jet towards the bottom. So the tank parts are pretty standard. You can tell the handle is replaced since it's supposed to have the more fancy handle that most modern Kohlers have, and similar to that of really old vintage Kohlers. But it's obviously replaced. Here you can see a standard fluid master fill valve as well as a standard flapper. Not much to say here, but they work out pretty well. You can also tell this tank is pretty tall, considering that this was also used in the Portrait Lite model as well, which is obviously a Wellworth Lite, but fancy. So they pretty much reused the tank for the Ingenium model, which I definitely think was probably the best choice they could have made. Let's have a look at a flush. Honestly, a pretty good flush. Given the extra gravity of the tank, I definitely think the flush on this is easily some of the best I've seen on the Ingenium. It's pretty strong and pretty good. I really like how powerful it is, and you can thank the tank for that. In return, the pulling and siphon power on this thing is pretty good. Due to the extra gravity this tank offers, the flush is pretty strong, and the pulling factor is integrated in the flush pretty well, meaning that you'll rarely see anything left behind. It's pretty good. The performance is also not too bad on this thing either. Even on earlier models from the late 1990s, which is not well known for being the best performers, I definitely noticed that these perform a lot better compared to something like the Wellworth or Highline from the late 1990s. It's quite nice, honestly. It isn't perfect per se, but it's not bad at all. Now let's have a look at bowl rinse. Honestly, not bad. I like the fact that this has angled rim just like most Ingeniums, and it cleans out the bowl pretty well. I definitely think the bag might struggle a little bit, but overall, it's not bad. Here's another angle. And that is the Kohler Portrait Ingenium toilet, probably one of the best redesigns of the Ingenium I've seen. It takes all the good factors of the original Ingenium and makes it even better with this nice and fancy design. While the original Ingenium is good, this one, on the other hand, is pretty good. But let's put this toilet into the grading scale. Let's grade it. So I'll obviously be comparing this toilet to the Wellworth and Highline Ingenium toilets. So let's get started. So for overall design, I gave the Wellworth and Highline Ingenium a 6. While it's a very plain design, it is somewhat iconic. Though objectively, the Kohler Portrait looks a lot better. While yes, this design was ported over from the Portrait Lite, unlike the Portrait Lite, it actually is a functional toilet that doesn't clog on everything. Nor does it have a ridiculously tiny trapway opening that can't even fit a golf ball. I'm not even being sarcastic about the last part. The design gets an 8. The original parts are more or less the same as each other. They both have very simplistic parts, but they work fairly well, and generally do their jobs pretty effectively. And not only that, can simply be changed out when needed. I'm ranking both a 7. For the most part, the quality control on both of these toilets is pretty good, and they seem to function fairly well for early 1.6 gallon toilets. Rarely has problems, rarely has defects, not too much you can complain about. Some people might point out performance, but that was improved in the later years. Overall, both get an 8. The trapway is decently designed on both of these toilets, so they both get a 7. Not much to compare, honestly. The flush on the Wellworth and Highline is not bad. It is somewhat swirly and has the pulling factor pretty well implemented into the flush. I gave it a 7. But in comparison, the flush on the Portrait Ingenium is actually pretty good. It's a lot more swirlier, it's a lot more powerful, it's a lot more good. The extra gravity and the tall tank definitely help out with this flush, making it a far superior flush. I give the Portrait Ingenium an 8 on flush. The pulling and siphon powers of both of these toilets is pretty good. For the Wellworth and Highline Ingenium, I gave it an 8. But on the Portrait Ingenium, it's more or less the same, except it's a lot more powerful. Other than that, it's about the same. I also give it an 8. The performance is pretty fine on both toilets. While the late 1990s Wellworth and Highline Ingenium don't perform as good as, say, the later ones, the performance of the later ones definitely do make up for that. I will say the Portrait Ingenium definitely performs a smidge better, but more or less it's about the same. I give them both a 7. The ball runs on the Kohler Wellworth and Highline Ingeniums is not bad at all. I gave it a 7. But I will say the ball runs on the Portrait Ingenium is a lot better, mostly because it's a lot more swirlier, the bowl is not as deep, and of course the angled rim jets. It's a lot more applied here compared to the Wellworth and Highline Ingenium. The ball runs definitely seems a lot better on the Portrait Ingenium. I have to give it an 8. It's pretty good. The survivability of both of these toilets is very strong. In a good setting, these things can last a very good long time, so I give both an 8. When I reviewed the Wellworth and Highline Ingenium toilet, the final value I gave it is an 8. I definitely think it's a fairly good toilet for what it is. It may have some minor drawbacks in some of the earlier parts, but for the most part, it's a fairly good toilet and it's utilized very well for 1.6 gallons. In comparison, I definitely think the Kohler Portrait Ingenium is a lot stronger in some aspects. The flush is better, the ball runs is better, and it has a much nicer design in comparison. The only problem is that it was very expensive back in its day. Of course, this toilet is no longer sold, so you could probably get one for fairly cheap. If you can ever get your hands on one, I definitely think this is the far superior Ingenium. Sure, it's more or less the same toilet but with a nicer design, but it definitely has some improvements compared to the standard versions, which I find very interesting for a fancy toilet like this. For the Portrait Ingenium, I give it an 8 in value. Now let's compare the final scores of both toilets. The Kohler Wellworth and Highline Ingenium got a 73 out of 100, but the Kohler Portrait Ingenium gets a 77 out of 100. For an early Ingenium design, I'm surprised the Portrait is far superior compared to the original model as it is. Sure, for most people it just looks like a fancy Ingenium, but in comparison to the original design, I'm surprised it offers a lot more better qualities compared to the original toilet. While I definitely think the Wellworth and Highline Ingenium toilets are good, I definitely think the Portrait Ingenium is the far superior model. Now I want to see how the other Ingenium models compare. Well, we'll eventually find out.